Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next speaker, Johannes Dienst, presenting the topic, Useful and Beautiful Developer Docs and How to Create Them.
Hello, hello. It's so funny when the AI pronounces a German name. It's actually Johannes, but nobody can say that outside of Germany, of course. Cool, you're all here. Always some enthusiastic people in the front, which is cool after lunch. So hopefully nobody's falling asleep, because the topic is one close to my heart, and it's a condensed talk of everything I learned about developer docs in the last 1.5 hours. Being in charge of the developer docs of the company I'm employed at. So one day I come down from my home office. It's 2 floors up in the under the attic, and my little daughter, she's 9, she learns crocheting. And has somebody done crocheting? Yeah, somebody. Actually, if you can do it, it's pretty easy. You know the steps to start and that stuff. But when you think about it, it's a very finicky task. You have this thread and it has to wrap around your finger and has the right tension. Then you have this stupid needle who gets hung up in the wool, and you all have to use this funny patterns. No, don't want to enable dictation. You have to learn all these patterns to make a beautiful like hat or something like that. And she was sitting there nearly into tears and very enraged because she couldn't do it yet. And I said to her, yeah, what you're doing is actually very hard when you start out. You have to learn all the things that go into it. It's a process. And then she said, yeah, but I watched this tutorial. I did everything the lady said I should do, but it didn't work. It didn't work out. And then I watched the tutorial myself and saw, oh yeah, there were 2 steps hidden behind the hand in the tutorial. My daughter, because she didn't know what was missing, couldn't complete it. So the tutorial was faulty and she couldn't learn how to crochet this specific pattern right. And there was another thing that enraged her, because the tutorial said, in the tutorial, the lady said, yeah, that's easy. Yeah, maybe for me, because I can crochet a little bit, but if you're just starting out, no, that's not easy. So, and these are the 2 things I learned about documentation, and this is just a tutorial. Never ever tell someone something is easy when they're just starting out, or even when they're experienced. Never ever do this. And if you have faulty documentation or no documentation at all, basically no one can use your product. That's how it is. And in this talk, we will tackle both problems here, like documentation, how it makes or breaks your product, and how to improve your documentation so it supports your product, and how to get rid of those easy and simple steps that actually are not easy by static linting and using docs as code. And if you don't take it from my little anecdote here, you can trust the experts /data. They conducted a survey with developers over 140 languages, not languages, countries. For over 14,000 developers answered this developer program benchmarking survey. And one of the key findings was documentation is the single most important resource to developers. So if your documentation sucks, your product sucks. That's how I read this. So now let's start. How do we get from the right side, like, oh, I want to use this product, but I don't know how, to the left side where I say, yeah, this is a great product. I can use it. I can support my case. Of course, if you think about great docs, who heard about the Stripe docs already? A few. Everybody who thinks I need to improve my docs, Googles how to improve my docs, and there's the Stripe documentation because it's mentioned in all the talks like I did. This is a well thought out documentation. It's way overboard. It's custom built also. There's no framework on it like Docusaurus or another static site generator framework. So yeah, you can aim for this, but actually it's over the top. They're way ahead of all the other documentations. But there's also developer portals, and there's also award, yearly award. I think this is from 2022. There's also the 2023 award already out. And there are more cool examples of documentation, like the Ivan documentation. They also made a very cool blog post that's on the left side, how they fuse the API docs and the SDKs with all things in this documentation. So this is cool. Also the plate docs, which are nice and clean, I think. And I love the documentation platform for Platform OS because you have this nice search bar and also some segmentation, so you can get guided very, very effectively. So when I started out 1.5 years ago, let's see how this works. This is a little bit small. I was tasked, the first task was, okay, get our product installed. Yeah, and I went to the docs naturally. That's what I do and what a lot of developers do if they want to try out your product, and was greeted by this. Like what? This is a repeat of our homepage. Totally unnecessary. So, okay, I clicked and I was already annoyed. Then I get here and again, I get reiterated why we should use Ask UI. Okay, I already read your homepage, so why should I read this again? I want to get installed. And these are only the obvious things you notice. Like you already lose developers because they have to click 2 times. You have to minimize the click things. What I also noticed was, oh, there's no search bar. So if I search a specific thing, it's not here. Then I have to click another 2 times to actually get started and installing Ask UI. And you can run us on every platform, macOS, Linux, and Windows. Problem is every installation procedure is different for each platform. So a little bit, and there are also specific ways it could go wrong. And you have one installation, and you have way too much detail to get started, like, okay, install all these dependencies. And this is what they actually do. Like, who reads this if they just want to try out your product? Yeah, so I was not happy with it. And funnily enough, it didn't work at the start. So we had our customer profile is more like someone from testing who does know a little bit of test automation. They often come from Java or Python. Yeah, I could get it to work because I came from TypeScript at a time. I know how to my way around to NPM, but we had a lot of problems with customers who just came from Python were thinking like, what does this strange NPM error mean? Also the API docs, which is more like for experienced. Yeah, click. Yeah, it clicks an element. No examples, no use case on where you want to actually do it. What is click? Mouse left click, tab, mouse right click. No explanation whatsoever. So yeah, this helps a lot if you're using a SDK and just learning. No, not really. So these are very obvious things. And then I thought, okay, let's get a little bit more methodical and thought about, okay, what do I want from a developer perspective? So how do we make our docs useful? And if you're thinking about developers, and I hope a lot of developers are here, and sometimes they get into sales calls, and our sales people try to explain the SDK or a no-code platform to the customers. And the best customers are actually developers because they say, I want to do this, and I need resources from you. And then I point them to 5 resources and an example repository, and they just go off, and the next day they write an email, yeah, we got it to work. Perfect. Developers are cool. Yeah. The funny thing about developers is that they usually come with a real goal in mind. They're not coming to your tool and say, yeah, I want to install a vector store and use it. That's not how you, as a developer, approach a product. It's more like I build a retrieval augmented generation example just to learn some stuff. And that's how I come to select a vector store. It's not like, oh, I want to try a vector store. No, I need a vector store to actually do something in the real world. So throw all those features out of your documentation. You already know what your product can do. What we need is, we have a real world application, what we want to develop, a real world goal. We need directions on how to achieve this goal. That's it, how you should think about documentation. Another way to think about your documentation is like, you have this tool, and in this case it's a hammer, because everything that looks like a nail needs a hammer as a tool. You wouldn't use this hammer to drive in a screw. That's not how you use the tool. But give a child a hammer and they don't know what it is used for. So they try to hammer in the screw and it doesn't really work. So without the instructions to use your tool correctly, it is useless. So with that in mind, and with very limited knowledge at that time, I did something. So that's the next version of our docs a few months later. You already see we don't have this annoying start page anymore because it's useless. Also got rid of the starting page after that. Just say, okay, if you want to try out our tool, and that's the best thing you can do if you want a really fast onboarding, take something like Gitport or GitHub Codespaces or StackBlitz if it's possible. We use GitHub because it's Gitport because it's not possible, and then guide your user already. This is not perfect, as I said. Different problems on different platforms, but it's better. You can try it out in Gitport, that's fast, or you can try out the local installation. That's cool. We also have a search box here, which doesn't work right now because it's local deployment. And I'm coming from software architecture. We have a lot of specific product terminology. So I added a terminology, restructured the troubleshooting, which is now not general, but platform specific. You already noticed that, hopefully, that we restructured a little bit. There's an anti-pattern. If you think about psychology, you can hold max 7 things in your head. So if your menu has more than 7 menu items, it gets cluttered. Some even say it's 3, so you should aim for less. And you also see guides is strange because guides is more like a trash bin for every content you don't know where to put. What we also did, we expanded a little bit our API docs. So now we have some ASCII art. We also have a lot of examples, and we also have GIFs, so you know what a specific command does. This is already much more helpful than the version before. In the title I said it's beautiful. How do you create beautiful developer docs? And I have a very specific opinion there. I think I already discussed with Chichi yesterday if this is practical, because I think beautiful is not that important to developer docs. Does anyone recognize this art, this where this documentation comes from? So, someone configured an Nginx. Yeah. I think that's the most ugly but most useful documentation ever I encountered. There's not even a search. It's a one-pager, a very long pager, but but with very toned down markdown. The DOM is very efficient, so you can search with your browser. And the cool stuff is I configured a complete reverse proxy with this single documentation because it's so great. You search something like, oh, I need a custom error page. How do I redirect this? You find it. You have a short explanation. You have examples, and you know what to do. So my stance is, yeah, beautiful developer docs, cool stuff, but actually not necessary. But if you want to have a nice example, I think I have to Google this. Let's see, it's minor 8, right? Does it work? I don't have the password. Okay, I wanted to show the empathy platform, so you just have to Google it. It's also a clean documentation, but they have a little bit more design to it, and you can drill down. I cannot show it right now. So for me, it's all about developers want solutions, they want directions, and if the documentation achieves their goal, then perfect. Design follows function in this. That's also why the Stripe docs are cool. If we get back to that example, you can try out everything on the left in your code and see the effects on the right, or almost the other way around. So you can try out stuff. It's very hands-on documentation, and that's useful. Okay, so with that in mind, let's get back to our docs, to version 3. So as you can see, nothing changed from the start page. I'm not happy with that because we need some platform-specific things there, but we restructured our menu here. So now it's called Getting Started, so everybody knows what it is. We have some how Ask UI works, because sometimes it's interesting to see how a product works. And then we have installing Ask UI. Don't know what this is. I removed it. And then we have you write your first instruction. Then we restructure to, okay, what does the user actually want to do? So giving more directions. So it's UI automation. So the user wants to select elements, of course. So we have element selection and we have different element selections. Still a little bit too much here, but in the next version, hopefully that's gone. Also, we want to execute automations and of course, integrations. So this already looks better. Yeah. So the structure of the menu is also important to find things. I'm pretty sure everybody went to some documentation site and you have this endless menu and you think, yeah, where's the thing I need to find? And if you don't have a great search, your customer is basically doomed. So the next question was like, okay, now we have this restructuring, we have some nice API docs, we trying to guide our developers here. Problem is our developers are diverse. Like I already said, some come from test automation, different languages they use. Not the typical developer, more like RPAs, robotic process automation people. So is this actually useful to all of these people? And I see that the problem, you can't cater to everyone in one documentation, but you can give them specific directions. So there's a marketing term, segmentation, as far as I know, but I use it here because it fits. So what we did was thinking about, and funny enough, we had a company workshop where we defined our personas or ideal customer profile. And we had 4 customer profiles, 3 of which we wanted to actually target with the documentation. And that's nice. So you also, and that's what a lot of developers might not want to hear, but talk to sales. What is their usual sales call? Where are the people coming from? They have all the data you need to actually craft your perfect documentation because they get to see who wants to have their problem solved with a product. So talk to sales. Sales is it's easy in a startup. I only have 2 guys to talk to, so I can get the information. But it's important to get this information so you can do this segmentation. One example I brought before, but I think it's a very cool example, is the platform OS documentation. You have to search. If you're just starting out and don't know what to search, or if you're looking for something specific and cannot find, a very powerful search. But they also have different use cases and you can see it. So if you're just getting started, click on the Getting Started. If you're a developer, cool, go to developer guide. You also have the API reference, which is usually used by more experienced users. Also have best practices and the use cases, and I don't know what the platform as kits is. So I think this is a very good example of how to do segmentation correctly. They know their customers, they have specific guides for them, specific directions. This is another one. I don't know ABN AMRO what they actually do. It looks a little bit like fintech. They also do this, so they have explore our APIs. Did you know that most of the APIs are actually not used by developers? But more than 50% are used by business people. They program against APIs to get something done. So API docs are specific for a specific persona. They have also how to get started and also a more deeper developer blog. So a nice example of a segmentation task. If you don't want to talk to sales, you should at least get your customers' user goals. And user goals are more theory, but if you put them in practice, they're very, very powerful because user goals are always rooted in the real world. As I said before, when I build an RAG example, I don't get to say, oh, I just try out a vector store because there are so many out there with their AI hype. I come there and say, I want to build this example, this specific example. So I have this goal in mind. So rooted in the real world. And then you get to ask your salespeople, what is your persona, what they're actually trying to achieve. And in our case, I wrote everything down. They have a few example user goals. They're actually They are not that important. I would say you say, yeah, they're not important. That's the wrong word. Sorry, not a native English speaker. It's not fascinating. When they come to our documentation, they always come with, oh, I want to automate on an Android device. That's one user goal. Or I want to automate a native Windows application. So you see a lot of UI automation. And the user wants to automate a native macOS app or a combination of all the three. I want to do something cross-platform. That's how our users come to us. That's what we got out of our sales calls and all the customers we talk to. So this is important information. These are your directions. You won't go and say, yeah, how do I give a direction in your documentation on your starting page on how to automate a web browser, because that's not what your customers want to see. They want to do this stuff. And then it becomes tricky, because then you have to go deeper into theory and think about learning objectives. And learning objectives have something to do with user goals. You can derive some learning objectives out of the user goals, but they are completely different from user goals. User goals are rooted in the real world, and learning objectives are rooted in intellectuality. They are intellectual goals. So if you want to achieve a specific user goal, you need a lot of learning objectives covered. So you need a lot of intellectual goals covered. And these learning objectives have a few characteristics. Broadly, there are sometimes more, depending on where you read about it. They fall into three categories. One is applicable skill. An applicable skill is something, when we get back to the Android example, the user should be able to connect our software with their device. Cool, now the device is connected. Okay, that's one step in the user goal, and you see where I'm going with this. You need a lot of applicable skill to actually get your user goal across. Then they need to do some text selection or some element selection in our case. So what do they need? A learning objective that tells them what is even there. When we're talking about text selection, so there are different methods, like you say, it's an exact match, it's a regex match, it's a contains match, or just a similarity metric or some kind of stuff. That's everything you can do with text, for example. So you need to be aware. So the next category is awareness. And we formulated a learning objective. The user should be able to describe the different methods used to select text. You see, that's not applicable. They just know, oh, there's these different methods. And to achieve a user goal, you also need this third category, comprehension. So now the user knows what to do, what they can do, but they don't know how to use it correctly. That's where comprehension comes into place. So sometimes you have a long text. So if you match for similarity, if your OCR is bad, then it's hard. So you may have to use a regex, for example. So you need to know what these different methods actually do. So comprehend them and put them into place. And you need all of three categories to usually achieve a user goal. There's another thing about learning objectives I always find fascinating when I'm coming from software architecture, because everything software architecture does is, okay, we have these modules and we define how they work together. And if you're defining learning objectives, they usually lead to pages in your documentation that are self-contained and not duplicated. That's cool. From a software architecture point of view, yeah, no duplication, cool stuff, actually. And what you can do is say, okay, so you have this learning objective, you have to connect an Android device, and then you have this learning objective, how do I actually select text? And then you can say, before you select text on an Android device, please read this learning objective. And you only have to maintain one piece of documentation, one page. So it becomes easier to maintain. I hope I can find the example where you didn't do this and it led to a lot of confusion. And especially this Android example, everybody who wanted to automate Android got stuck somewhere because the documentation was on two different places and it was different on each place because we forgot to maintain it. Yeah, that's exactly what happens if you don't separate, if you don't modularize your documentation. So with that in mind, let's first look at the previous version and say, okay, where's the problem? So we have tutorials. So we have a web search on Android tutorial. That's where people come in. And we have to prepare something here. There's also automate web search. Yes. Was it the right? I can't even find it. So I think it's a Flutter sample Android. So we have to do something. Yeah. So Android documentation is completely scattered. I think we already solved it here. Yeah, single device automation, multi-device automation. Yeah. So we have here some Android. What you have to do on Android, and also some mobile automation. There's another Android stuff. So you see these learning objectives are not really modularized. And sometimes there was also duplication. And depending on which tutorial our users read, they got confused, which is not the thing we want. So this is not the last example, the last iteration of our docs, but one that is recent. Yeah, it's 0.18.0. You can see I got some tiles in here based on the personas I mentioned before. So if you're coming now and see our documentation, you don't get to look at the menu, you look at the tiles and, oh, I want to automate Android. I want to automate Windows. Actually, Windows is the most important stuff here because everybody wants to automate desktop applications on Windows. If you're coming from enterprise and have a lot of proxies and lockdown machines because they're managed, then yes, you have enterprise checklists, which exactly tells you what to do. If you don't have the permissions, contact your IT department and all that stuff, because a lot of users in enterprises are not even aware that there's a proxy. You have to tell them. So we give them the directions to actually make our product work there. That's very important. That's also what we got out of the sales calls. Yeah, that's what we did. And we also had a new product here. That's okay. We restructured the getting started to actually be platform specific. So you don't have to read about Mac OS if you're a Windows user. Nice. And we hit a lot of stuff. So it's not Linux. So yeah, you just use init now. So the dependency stuff, that's not important if you're getting started. Maybe later if you do some security checks on the packages. And also the guides got a little bit cleaned up and we hit the tutorials in the examples and you can see, okay, how do we automate mobile devices? How do you automate multiple devices? And that's the usual use cases. We broke it down to just 2. So it's missable. So I hope you learned that modularizing your documentation and coming from user goals, breaking down to learning objectives. This is not a straight path. This is different for every product. That's just what we did here. For us, it's not completed. Documentation is always a work in progress, especially in a startup when the goalposts change all the time. Yeah. And then you get a better documentation. The documentation now is comprehensive, and usually if a user asks something, I can point them to the right direction and they don't get confused. They can solve it by themselves if they're capable enough. So how did we actually build this? And this is one of my favorite slides. So you go from user goals to objectives. That's what I already said. Then design follows function. So how do you build it on the technical side? Because I wanted to do something in the code, in the IDE here. And I'm a developer myself. I love docs as code. Already did it with Arc42 and AsciiDoc when I did software architecture. And docs as code are great if you're living in an organization who is mainly consistent of engineers, because it's easy to write. If you use Markdown, it's basically very, very simple to write. You can get every engineer to follow the rules because they are logical. It's very easy to review. We use GitHub. You can use Git to review, do pull requests, do comments, everything. You can do everything you do with code. If you're in an enterprise environment, you can even style it. Like when I worked at the enterprise company, we had these style guides, easily covered with CSS and a processor. Pretty cool. You can do versioning, so you can throw over documentation, can bring it back. Also nice thing. And personally, I don't like WYSIWYG. Who's using a wiki here? Oh, barely nobody. Like Confluence? Some people. Yeah, Confluence. Confluence was the thing I had to say. Yeah, I always hated Confluence because that is where documentation goes to die. That's the thing. Yeah, every wiki is like that, and that's the problem because everybody can dump their brain into the documentation, and it's not well architectured. And in the moment you do docs code, you can say nobody pushes to main without a review, and then already gets better because someone else is looking at the documentation, just because of that. Our tech stack, pretty simple. We use some standard software like Docusaurus. You can use everything like mkdocs, an example. And we use linters. For me, importantly, the Alex linter, which lints for profanity and inclusive language. And we switched from a spell checker to prose linting with Whale. Whale is open source. You can use it however you like. You can define there custom rules. You have to custom terminology and all that stuff. You can, for example, say, okay, I don't want something like e.g. in your documentation, because that's more or less like not everybody knows how to do it. So you want to have the most simplistic language in your documentation. That's what you want. And Whale can lint for that. That's the cool stuff. And let's show how that works in the IDE. I hope that's, I can make it a little bit bigger. You have to install it, at least on macOS, and then you can define some rules. And how do you lint it? It's like Whale and the directory you want to lint. And the configuration here is like, okay, lint every markdown file. And of course, I put something there the linter can actually find, because it would be not, no, that's not what I want. So it says, okay, if I say Whale docs, we have our ASCII specific terminology there, but it also has a spell checker. So did you really mean automation? No, I meant automation, of course. And it also lints for profanity and inclusivity. And then it says, yeah, bigger, maybe that's offensive. And as a non-native speaker, that's not obvious to me. And then I ask, I think Llama 3, large language model, to explain to me why bigger is a profanity and what I should use for this. And it said, yeah, in some cases, it has a sexual connotation. And you can capture that in your pipeline and fail the build if you like. I wouldn't recommend it because in this context, it's not offensive, of course, but you can lint for that. And it's also only a warning. But we caught some very interesting spelling. How does that work? We use a pre-commit hook. It's called Husky. Funny enough, Husky can also be offensive in some cultures. Okay. The explanation slipped my mind. So you have a pre-commit hook and say, okay, I only want to lint for the specific documentation, the latest documentation. You can also, there's a GitHub action for it. It just checks out the repository with depth 1, and then, okay, does the same thing like, okay, these are all the files I want to have linted. So you get linting for this repository. And then that's where the tooling a little bit hangs up. We had to create another repository where all the styles live. And what I do here is check it out myself here and just link it here. And then we have this Alex rules, and we also have, for example, the accept rules, where everything we use in our documentation that Whale says is a spelling error or just missing something it doesn't know, that's what we want to have here. And you can also reject words like easy. That's where the thing comes from. And basically, because that is condescending for our users. So if anybody comes to the documentation, opens a pull request, the build will fail and say, okay, please don't use easy. It's not inclusive. It may enrage your users. And you can put all sorts of specific rules in there. So Camunda does a great job with this. In the pipeline, it's also the same. Check it out, use it. And we can distribute this rule set over all our documentation, even in READMEs. Check it out in a pipeline. Lindauer docs have a specific set of rules we want to follow. So our documentation always looks the same. Okay, I was already reminded that we only have 10 minutes left. So the takeaways, what did we want to tackle? How do we actually architect our documentation to be useful for our users? They have a goal in mind. They don't care about features because they evaluate it on your homepage, hopefully. And they come with a goal in mind. Then design is not as important. It follows function at best. Nice design is cool, but if it doesn't solve the problem, it's useless. So first, define your user goals, talk to sales, define your ideal customer profile, know what they're doing, talk to your customers, get your community involved to find the user goals users try to solve. And then define the learning objectives as modular as possible, so it's easily maintainable for you, and support the user goals. That's an ongoing process because, yeah, I'm also learning. And then last but not least, that's not a must, but I love docs as code, especially in an engineering organization, because it gives you all those things like the review, and you can bring back stuff. You can do linting with all the tools you already know. And that's it. I didn't do an intro. If you want to connect with me, do it here. Sometimes I also live stream, where you can see that I'm actually not the greatest coder, but I'm struggling a lot with a lot of documentation. Now I have a sharper eye for documentation, so it's even more funny. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes. Now we have some time left for questions. And do anybody have some in the audience? Please raise your hand. Yeah, and somebody will bring your microphone. One guy here.
Okay, question is, you mostly talk about technical documentation, but what about business documentation? Because business documentation is quite related with the technical documentation now.
Business documentation from software architecture or?
From business processes,
business
and
processes?
how we develop this business processes. And how this documentation could live together.
I think I'm not qualified to talk about this, but the general thing is always documentation only gets read when it's for your audience. So the problem a lot of people have is if they're writing documentation, they don't want to write the documentation because nobody knows who reads it. So I would always ask who is reading your documentation and design it like this. That's the only thing I can say about this.
Anybody else? Thank you. A small technical question, I guess. It's nice when you do like a pull request and you mentioned the example with like easy being a potentially harmful term. Ideally, I don't really want to see what's bad. I want to see how can I fix this quickly. Do you think it would be possible to also in such cases get the context in which, for example, the word is being used so that you can immediately offer relevant suggestions to fix the problem?
Alex usually does this. Sometimes Whale does this also. When you define custom rules, like for example with the a.g. You can add a context and then it gets printed out to the console. So yes, you can do this. Also, you can, it says, okay, this is offensive. Yeah, thanks for mentioning. This is offensive, but you can also provide a solution for it. Like say, don't use easy. Don't use it at all. For the bigger, I think the Llama 3 could be added to. It said, yeah, this is use something like elusive. I think it was this or like. I don't know. I don't know what the specific term is actually. Yes.
I think we have one more question. Somebody in the audience, yeah.
I think I might have. Can you hear me? Yeah. I had a question between the iterations. How did you gather feedback? How to improve the documentation, and did you measure that it became better? Like, did you have any? Yeah. Did you get user feedback? Oh, this is actually better. How did you do that?
Once I use it myself extensively because I also document for myself. I forget a lot. So I knew, okay, I can find the information, but it's always about qualitative feedback. So we have this thumbs up button, I think. Can we see it some here? So we can thumbs up, thumbs down. Yeah, that's not clicked often. But actually we ask our customers who bought the product and ask them, and really talking to your customers. That's the key, qualitative feedback. Because often the customers say, yeah, I tried to set up Android and it didn't work. I don't know what this step does. And then you get the feedback. Sometimes also the customers say, yeah, pretty easy. Also happens, yeah.
Anybody else? Don't hesitate, just raise your hand. Yeah, no. So we can move to slide questions. We have few of them there and few minutes left. First of one, you mentioned interviews with sales department to learn about more user needs. Did you also use another data sources for improvement opportunities?
So usually you want to have a community for your product. So that's where usually a developer advocate gathers a community. It's not okay. It's not too big our community. I usually talk to customers who are bought our product and they have some developers, and I usually try to get in contact with them, not the one who bought, but actually who's using it. Yeah, and also we have analytics of our product, and we see if somebody tries something in five different ways, they're struggling with a specific thing, like selecting a specific text. And then you can also track, okay, they visited the documentation on this part and they're still stuck. So at some point you could reach out to that customer and say, hey, you're still stuck. What do you need to succeed? Yeah.
Another one. How do you properly manage docs connection to app/platform features so that if features change or deprecated, nobody forgets to update docs too?
Oh, I love this question. Oh, every time I do this docs talk. I haven't the answer for this, and it's also the same with software architecture. The best thing you can do is provide a Jira task for it, documentation in your process. So if you create something, there's a task already attached for documentation. The next thing you can do, what we also tried, but works as good as you tried, is to do a monorepo where the documentation lives together with the code. That's also something. So if someone reviews, you have good review practices, which comes to process, then you see, okay, there's some change, but there's no documentation for it. And then you can say, yeah, that's a acceptance criteria. There's documentation. But basically what only works is it comes down to process. So how well is your process defined and how well are you following the process? This disconnect is really hard to get solved, actually.
There are a few more questions, but we really out of time. So thank you, Johannes. Applause for him.